Hello, everyone. My name is John C. Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Thank you all for joining us today as we commemorate the fifth anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings. That was a tragedy that was a wake-up call for our community and nationwide. But even before that, we knew that our communities were under attack. We knew that our communities had been warning about that growing anti-Asian hate that had been consuming in the COVID and post-COVID era. During that time, organizations like Advancing Justice Atlanta and members of Congress like Representative Grace Meng had been sounding alarm bells. And part of our discussion today is to talk about what that led up to that, what actions we've been able to take since, and what lessons we've learned. Now, one thing that it's important to recognize that FBI data shows that hate crimes against anti-Asian continue at elevated levels. Now, in 2020, when we were still under lockdown, FBI recorded about 279 incidents. In 2022 and 2023, the numbers were 499 and 407 respectively. The last year, the data which is available, which is for 2024, showed 379 incidents against anti-Asian violence, which is still triple pre-pandemic levels. Now, the reality is that we know that all of this is underreported data based on work that all of our communities have done. That's nevertheless part of the issue is because of the fact of interagency inconsistencies, resources devoted to understanding what is happening in our community. Now, during this time, leaders such as Representative Meng responded to this tragedy by working to lead, along with Senator Mazie Hirono, for the passage of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was an act that aimed to strengthen the infrastructure of the response, from language accessible reporting pathways to better coordination and public awareness. Crucially, it also created space for non-law enforcement options like state-run hate hotlines that can connect people to services safely and in many languages. In California, for example, the California versus Hate resource line, which is an 888 number, and the network that was launched as a non-emergency, non-law enforcement pathway across the state, was in part inspired and resourced by the legislation. Now, unfortunately, we've seen deeply disruptive federal actions since then. In April 2025, the administration terminated hundreds of DOJ grants mid-contract, including to community-based prevention and victim services programs, which triggered layoffs for these nonprofits and, crucially, lack of services for our victims. Now, we fought in courts and joined other partners and members of Congress to publicly press DOJ to restore these resources, noting the impact on community-based responses to hate. This pattern has been compounded by efforts to shutter or hollow out the DOJ's Community Relations Service, a group that has been called America's Peacemakers, which was created by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to de-escalate tensions and to support communities outside of policing. Unfortunately, without CRS, we have yet another resource that is no longer available to us. Now, meanwhile, harmful narratives have evolved, whether it's white supremacists espousing this great replacement theory about how Asian immigrants, including South Asian H-1B workers, are taking away from this country. Anti-Chinese rhetoric spills into scapegoating of Chinese and Asian Americans generally. And then Islamophobia, especially in the last few weeks, is increasingly normalized, even by public officials. Alongside this, nonprofits and civil rights advocates are facing hearings, letters, intimidation, doxing, vigilante-style investigations, with some hate groups claiming that anti-hate work is censorship or somehow extremist. At the end of the day, though, really at the heart of all of this is we have to remember the lives lost, the families that continue to mourn, and the communities everywhere who are suffering from this violence. We are honored to have with us Congresswoman Grace Meng and Anjali Nair. Anjali is the Deputy Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, to discuss what happened in the hours and days after the tragic shooting, what worked, and what must be done to keep our communities safe. And how we will do this is first we're going to have some opening remarks from Anjali and then Representative Meng, and then we're just going to engage in a conversation with each of them to talk about some of these issues that I've outlined. So let me start by yielding the microphone to Anjali.
Thank you, John. And so I just wanted to note and acknowledge on March 16th, 2021, 8 individuals, including 6 Asian women who are massage workers, were murdered at the 3 spas in the metro Atlanta area. And so, as we commemorate the 5-year anniversary of the tragedy today, we must acknowledge and remember it is one rooted in misogyny, white supremacy, and gender-based violence. And just like then, we must continue to center the victims, the survivors, and their loved ones. And we're struck that 5 years later, the animus against immigrants has only grown and our communities are increasingly still not safe. And so I want to share and acknowledge what happened when the headlines faded. And I also want to honor and acknowledge that I was not working here at the time and the organization's response was built by those who were here before me. In the immediate aftermath of the shootings, Advancing Justice Atlanta stepped into the gap. Atlanta did not have the necessary infrastructure to respond, let alone serve with the necessary cultural competence. Advancing Justice Atlanta stepped in not just as an organization that responded to a crisis, but as a hub for community. Together, we brought various leaders across Atlanta, several of whom are actually being recognized today at the Georgia State Capitol. From the start, we knew that justice for the families couldn't just be found in a courtroom, and it could only be found in community. So as we gathered communities to provide support in different ways, we pushed a collective statement that brought together over 2,000 organizations nationwide. And the call wasn't just for safety, it was a call for a community-centered response. So we launched massive fundraising efforts that directly supported the victims, survivors, and their families. And we became a bridge, gathering advocates and mental health professionals to provide the immediate in-language care to those impacted, as well as community members writ large. In 2022, a year later, we held a Remembrance Day. We realized that for our community to heal, we needed space to mourn together, for family members, advocates, and people to be gathered not as victims, but as a community and as a family. We also had local AAPI artists use art because words alone were not enough to carry the weight of the grief. We used the art to reclaim the narrative and to transform a site of violence into a space of radical hope. In 2023, we sought a way to make that healing visible. On that second remembrance, we planted a tree as a symbol of our commitment to stay rooted. We invited the community to come together in solidarity. In 2024, our work evolved from crisis response to building a more permanent space for community care. We hosted a community gathering that centered on mental health care with community leaders, mental health professionals, and artists who use art for healing inspired by the event. The event called for mental health care in our communities, to stand in solidarity with others, and to commit to deepening community care for all. Our current and former staff still remain in touch with the family members and survivors of the tragedy and work to continue community care. We continue to deepen our commitment to one another. We stand with the survivors, not just for remembrance, but every single day through our work. And we invite everyone to join us in remembrance of what was lost and stand in solidarity for a just and caring Georgia that we are building together.
Thanks so much, Anjali. And it's really touching and moving in terms of the work that you all are doing and how you're honoring the victims. Next, I'd like to reintroduce Representative Grace Meng, who is a representative from New York, who, like I said, among other things, co-authored and really championed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act during that time period, for a couple of opening remarks or thoughts about that time period that we lived through.
Hi, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Grace Meng, Chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or CAPAC. Thank you to John and Anjali, and really everyone in the AAJC family for not only hosting this important event, but also for the work that you have been doing since then and before and during. Today, we obviously are gathering to mark the 5 years since the tragedy, since the horrific Atlanta spa shootings that took the lives of these 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. And for many in our Asian American community, it was our worst nightmare come to life. During the pandemic, we saw a disturbing rise of anti-Asian hate, as John talked about. where Asian Americans were scapegoated. We were called racist slurs, like Kung Flu, that painted a target on the backs of our community members. The horrors of that day shook our communities to its core. Parents were worried about sending their children to school. Our elders feared for their safety just going to the grocery store, and business owners worried about being the target of hate-filled acts. But in the wake of this unspeakable tragedy, we also saw resilience. Our community came together, for example, to advocate for the passage of my COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was successfully signed into law to help improve our federal and local response to hate crimes. And while this was a major step in protecting our communities, it's clear that there was and is more work to do. In the 5 years since the shootings, we've continued to see how dangerous rhetoric and policies continue to put our families, our neighbors, and loved ones at risk. Today, the Trump administration's attacks on immigrants, its scapegoating of our communities, and the normalization of anti-Asian language continue to stoke hatred and division. We cannot allow history to repeat itself. And that's why KPAC will continue to stand up against hate and fight for policies that protect our communities. We must work together to build a future where Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are safe and treated with dignity and respect. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to today's conversation.
Great. Thank you, Representative Mang. And so, in listening to you, I really appreciate those remarks. I'm kind of interested because as we talk about 5 years, it might be useful also to think about like during right after the shootings, like what was it that members of Congress, especially KPAC, what were you thinking about? How did you galvanize? We obviously, for all of us, it was a galvanizing moment. But what did that look like, quote unquote, on the ground? Admittedly, the ground for you as Congress look like in those days behind the scenes?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it's important to go back to those first few days immediately afterwards. And like you both mentioned, this wasn't the first anti-Asian incident, right, that had happened. We had already seen a trickling of events that were leading up to this, if you will. But for some reason, my sense is that this tragedy was sort of a turning point for not just our community. We sadly were not shocked that something like this happened, but for many outside of our community, allies or not. And so immediately after the shootings, our KPAC members, we traveled to Atlanta to pay our respects to the victims and be with the community on the ground, meeting with the family members. And I remember in the hours and days afterwards, many of us got calls from people who had not necessarily reached out before, but people who wanted to continue to be or become allies, asking what they could do to help. In the fall, right before the shootings, the House had passed a bipartisan symbolic resolution that reaffirmed Congress's commitment to combating hate and violence targeting our community. But this tragedy was such a wake-up call that galvanized, like I said, not just our community, but other communities of color too. I'm really grateful for so many of my colleagues, for example, in the other caucuses from other communities who were amongst those who stood with us and fought against this rise in hate. And they were willingly and actively pledging ways and thinking of ways to help. And some of them said to members like me, hey, we know what it's like to be discriminated against and hated and even attacked. We were very fortunate to have a president in the White House, President Biden and Vice President Harris, who took this issue very, very seriously. They met with our caucus, KPAC, several times. They reached out the night of the tragedy, their teams, and pledged to work with us on combating anti-Asian hate and ensuring there were resources, more resources, to prevent and address these hate crimes. An effort that was not directly through Congress or our caucus, but really kind of rose up through allies as well. For example, a lot of state elected officials and community leaders around the country, people like then Assembly Member Evan Lowe in California, to Jason Chan, who heads the board of Apex, our nonprofit arm, to put together like a virtual day of action that many corporate leaders who maybe in the past had never even had an Asian Heritage Month event. And March 26th was the day that was chosen for a virtual day of action. This was in remembrance of the Naturalization Act, where non-white people could not become citizens. And so this was an example of something that was done, including the Empire State Building that was lit up in honor and remembrance of the victims in Atlanta and our community nationwide.
No, thank you. And I think it's great to talk about some of the actions that happen and some of the, and I always say it's like it's always hard to talk about in terms of tragedies, the good that comes of it, and and trying to make something out of all of that. Obviously, one thing that came out of it was the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which you were a champion of. And I think certainly components of that is how it helped to build community infrastructure, how it helped to create language access. I would like you to speak a little bit about sort of from your perspective, now that you've seen it implemented, admittedly in bumps and starts over the last few years, what has worked about it? What do you think what sort of positive change has that provided?
Sure. And to be clear, we were fortunate to be able to work with the House, the Senate, and a Biden-Harris administration to pass legislation quickly, which really was a compilation of efforts, not just the Asian community nationwide, but many different communities that had worked on discrimination issues, right? And who had all come together to put together this type of legislation. The law helped improve, federal, state, local coordination for hate crimes by creating a single point person within the Department of Justice to help expedite the review of these types of crimes. It also incorporated the Jabara Hire Act, No Hate Act, which authorized grants for our state governments so that they could set up hate crime reporting hotlines. As you all know, a lot of these crimes were not being reported. People were hesitant to report, and they weren't really being kept, there was no tracking of them nationally. Um, but this pervasive issue could not and still cannot be solved with just a bill, one law. Anti-Asian hate is still a major concern, as Anjali mentioned, for so many in our community, and it might look a little differently today, right? Um, but especially how we see online platforms, they're being used to spread misinformation and hate and radicalize people to promote that hate. The law was important, but we also can't prosecute our way out of hate crimes, right? We have a persistent problem with some local law enforcement jurisdictions to report, not reporting enough accurate data to the FBI about hate crimes in our own localities. And that's why KPAC continues to work on different and additional legislative efforts to promote accessible hate crimes reporting, expand mental health resources for victims, and crack down on gun violence to keep our communities safe.
Thank you for all of that. And I think you touched on one thing that I'd like to explore a little bit, which is like, obviously this is not going away, and it has taken different forms, whether it's because of Islamophobia now, whether it's because of the Great Replacement theory, whether it's because of our competition with the Chinese government. From your perspective, especially focusing for you, is what role do you think Congress can or should play in addressing addressing all of these different issues?
Well, of course, legislation is important, but now what we're seeing is the defunding of some of these programs and grants that have worked traditionally. And I believe we actually need to strengthen them and expand their outreach instead of what we're seeing right now coming from the administration, which is essentially defunding them. We need to make sure that there are community-based approaches, right? In and with our civil rights organizations, with our nonprofit organizations. They have trusted messengers, multilingual, culturally competent outreach, and early intervention work. The programs that we have seen in different states and localities around the country are what we need to build on nationally in Congress, right? Making sure that there is language access, right? Making sure that we have, like I said, community-based approaches to how we are listening and being responsive to victims and how we make sure that people know that when they're reporting something, it doesn't feel useless, and to encourage them to report it. So we have that data.
No, thank you for all of that. I think that's right. I think maybe the last question for you, touching on something that you're saying in terms of how civil societies, nonprofit organizations, works with members of Congress or Congress as a whole. I think one of the things that we've also been seeing is attacks on those organizations, suggesting that those organizations that are trying to protect against anti-hate are the ones that are extremist. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about what role Congress can play in ensuring that we have more civil dialogue, or that people embrace the role that some of these nonprofit organizations play.
Yeah, well, Congress needs to be continue to be and expand outreach to make sure that people understand that there are three branches of government, right? What we're seeing is the administration terminating, defunding hundreds of grants that have gone to local organizations in all of our communities in a nonpartisan way to serve victims of crime and near elimination of programs, trying to zero out programs that have been working and that our most vulnerable communities feel safe. And so we need to make sure that we are conducting oversight, holding the administration accountable. We have seen Congress, not just KPAC, do this through shadow hearings, amicus briefs, evidence gathering when our local organizations, staff members out there, community leaders out there in our audience, collect stories and testimonies and data that is really important. We're partnering with our colleagues, for example, in the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, so that we have a united front. Our communities may look a little different and our experiences may be a little bit different, but the hate and the tactics against us, unfortunately, are very similar. Last year, our Tri-Caucus led a joint statement condemning, for example, the baseless and motivated politically motivated probe into over 200 nonprofit organizations and religious groups that provide basic needs for our children, immigrants, and other at-risk populations. We have been working through filing these amicus briefs, challenging the administration's executive order for issues like trying to eliminate birthright citizenship, and seeing them trying to roll back key civil rights protections in many of our federal programs. So we just have to continue to use our voices to highlight what's happening and what's not happening, and to call out any intimidation tactics and rein in their abuses of power.
Thank you very much, Representative Meng. Really appreciate your thoughts and comments. I'm going to shift the conversation now to Anjali and really talk about sort of what has been the experience of the community. And I also really want to think about sort of what does the community still need today. You've talked about a number of the things that the community have done in that interim, also some of the, dare I say, positive progress that's been made. But obviously, that progress, there's more that needs to be done. I'd love to focus the conversation on sort of from your perspective what that looks like. And just so everyone that's watching, Representative May need to drop a little bit because she has a meeting that she needs to get to, but we really thank her for her time. So with that, Anjali.
Yeah, I want to echo what Representative Meng was saying. We need to ruthlessly and relentlessly every day call out acts of violence against immigrant communities, communities of color, and recognize that they can, and some often are, state-sanctioned federal and state government facilitated acts. The violence is encouraged and emboldened by racist, anti-immigrant, white supremacists, and extremist politicians in power. There are institutions and systems that we know to uphold gender-based violence and xenophobia. And when we say that, what that looks like is immigrants being afraid to send their children to school, to go to the doctor for urgent medical care, to seek resources when domestic violence happens. Because right now, people, regardless of their status, are being treated as others and not as humans of deserving dignity. And it also means that the rise of white supremacy and extremism in this country need to be called out. There continues to be further codification of these systems into law when we see the stripping away of bodily autonomy and complete increased funding to rogue paramilitary forces like ICE on our streets. And we have to recognize that the compounding effects are only furthered when there are gaps in language mental health services that understand immigrant trauma, grief, and other pressures to remain silent. We also have to continue to push back against dehumanizing narratives that initially surround the victims and also stigmas that society perpetuates on a daily basis. And we have to continue to acknowledge that increased raids and enforcement actions keep victims of labor exploitation, domestic violence, and sexual assault from reporting and coming forward. And this continues to create an environment of silence. And here in Atlanta, and especially and across Georgia, many in our community work in labor-heavy, immigrant-heavy sectors. There needs to be more worker protections that don't rely on increased policing, which often only lead to further harassment or deportation fears. And I also want to note we need hope. We need to continue to envision a world and safety that focuses on community-led solutions rather than punitive and carceral ones.
No, thank you very much for that. So maybe let me explore that, especially for you in Georgia right now. Is like, so what does that look like with respect to working with the legislature? What does it look like working with state and local government in terms of getting some of that change that you're looking to get?
Yeah, here in Atlanta, we're continuing to focus against carceral responses. This happened in the immediate aftermath of the spa shooting, and it continues to this day, working with legislators on the state and pushing back against the increasing federal policy landscape that we're seeing. It's important to acknowledge that Georgia has historically had the largest rate of incarceration of any democracy in the world based on the number of people incarcerated in facilities and or under state supervision with carceral schemes like alternatives to detention. And now in the immigration landscape, Georgia's on the rise to be an epicenter of immigration detention, having two large immigration facilities and having one of the largest physical warehouses set to be an immigration facility, an increased rise in cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. And so on a daily basis, we are working with legislators as well as local law enforcement and other agencies to push back against this trend. And what we're seeing is that infrastructure is continuing to contribute to anti-immigrant sentiment, and the state-sanctioned violence continues on. And it's important to recognize in Georgia, where the spa shootings happened in September 2025, we also saw the largest militarized ICE enforcement action happening at the Hyundai plant in Alabama, Georgia. So all of this happens when we have legislation that explicitly, for example, prohibits individuals from particular countries like China and Iran from buying particular pieces of land. So here in Georgia, we had to fight back and continue to have on the books land laws that prohibit particular individuals perceived to be from particular countries of origin from buying land. And go ahead. Sorry,
No,
John.
go ahead.
Sorry. No.
Yeah.
I was just going to say it's also important to note the locus of where we are here in Atlanta. We're also fighting against federal government that is invading the Secretary of
Mhm.
State's office based on these ill-conceived notions of
Mhm.
quote unquote fraudulent or ineligible voters. And so there continues to be this vacuum that's a hyper-intensive vacuum of misinformation as well as disinformation.
So I appreciate all that, and it's just the hard work you all in Atlanta are doing, really on the front lines. Because you're right, like the fear in immigrant communities is real. The eroding trust in our government is real. And so and yet you're making progress. I'm wondering, sort of like, how do you break through to whether it's your own community or break through to lawmakers as to, as you said, as you've rightly said, you've been successful in pushing back against some of these extremist measures. So what is the key to that strategy, at least from your perspective, if you don't mind me asking?
Course. From my perspective, I think it goes back to Representative Meng was also saying, I think it's working in multiracial coalitions and acknowledging that it's not a fight of a singular community, and we are all intertwined in the systems of marginalization and systems of oppression that work to push down communities of color. And I think it's continuing to center the voices of those that are directly impacted and making sure those voices are heard.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Now, one thing that you also said was that we have to have hope in this moment. So I'm going to ask you, what gives you that hope?
What gives me that hope is that there is nothing else. Besides hope, you give up. And I think at this moment in time, that is not an option. And I think we cannot simply wait for galvanizing moments to bring us together or to denounce hate. And I think on a daily basis, we have to call out acts of hatred. We have to call out the systems that continue to push down and silence. And also say that I think what gives me hope is continuing to center communities in not only the responses, but in the new paths forward that we envision and think of. And I think continuing to center even community responses and community cares over carceral ones is the only way that we can try to uphold what I think are fundamental tenets of democracy.
No, that's wonderful. I mean, I think that's wonderful to hear. Because I think part of this also, as I listen to you, is I'm thinking about the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And for anyone that's done that walk, the bridge is on a slope, so you actually can't see the other side of the bridge. And the only thing that gave them the courage to go forward was that hope. One could say it's blind hope because you don't know what's on the other side. And in the original walk, it was obviously a very painful, literally bloody walk. But nevertheless, just because you don't know what's on the other side shouldn't stop you from doing something, right? And that's what I'm hearing you say, which is very inspiring.
Exactly. And I'm not a hopeless romantic, but I'll say if we can believe in things like love, we can believe in hope. So.
Now, thank you for that. And I think that's a wonderful place to end this conversation because part of this is that certainly our message, and I think I could speak for you and Anjali as well as Representative Meng, is like there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done, both in supporting our communities, really remembering our communities and centering around our communities. And then that work has to look both at the local level, certainly also at the congressional, so-called national level. But while we do that work, we have a certain amount of hope, have a certain amount of optimism. It's not blind hope, like you're saying. It's not being naive, but it's also knowing that that's what it's always taken for all of our communities. And I very much appreciate also what you're saying about all of our communities being intertwined. And it's not just the Asian American community. It's not just communities of color. It's not just the LGBTQ community, but it's all of us and what we share together as humanity. So thank you very much for this conversation. I hope that everyone that's been watching this was able to take away something from this. Again, we certainly want to center ourselves around those victims in Atlanta 5 years ago, and the horrific circumstances that brought that to bear. And then also to hopefully to take away from this a little bit of hope, a little bit of action, a little bit of courage in how we move forward together. So thank you all for tuning in.